Hello everyone, and welcome to the 271st episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring one of our patron picks, Rorschach from Watchmen. Not all heroes wear capes, and not all evildoers are villains. Some people lie somewhere in between, and such is the case with Rorschach, a ruthless, unrelenting, and uncompromising vigilante who's just as iconic as the fantastic story that he appears in, and one whose moral code, worldview, and actions leaves him in quite the gray area morally. But how gray is that area exactly? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So without further ado, let's begin. The early life of Walter Kovacs was marked by an enormous amount of trauma and abuse. In the spring of 1935, Walter's mother Sylvia Joanna Kovacs and her husband Peter Joseph Kovacs moved from Ohio to New York City, and only 2 years after they made this move, their marriage would crumble under the weight of mutual accusations of mental abuse and adultery. For the next 3 years, Sylvia would live with a series of male companions, with her final semi-permanent relationship with another man speculated to have been the father of her one and only son, Walter Kovacs, who left her 2 months before Walter was born. A man by the name of Charlie, whose last name she either forgot or never knew due to the possibility that she had already become a prostitute at this time, and he was one of her many clients, or didn't wish to convey it to her son when asked about it because she didn't want him to seek him out for any number of reasons. Regardless of whether or not Charlie was a boyfriend or a client, and Sylvia was a prostitute during this period in her life, she would either become or remain one sometime after the birth of her son. Due to her first arrest for prostitution occurring shortly after Walter was born, the authorities speculated that she may have pursued this profession following her son's birth due to mounting debts and the cost of raising a child. And while that is indeed speculation, it would make a lot of sense if this were true, for Sylvia was cruel to Walter, crueler than a mother ever should be to her child, and feeling forced to become a prostitute in order to support a child who may have caused the last man she felt an attachment to leave her due to her pregnancy being part of the reason for this cruelty, while not excusable, at the very least allows us to understand how a mother could develop such resentment for her child. However, something else that may have fed her resentment of Walter was the child himself, who, even as a young boy, was marked as being a strange and ugly child, even by his mother. Whatever the case may be, Sylvia Kovacs was by all accounts a reprehensible human being and mother who traumatized her child through exposure to her profession and by verbally and physically abusing him in the process. A boy who, like all young boys, loved his mother and only wanted to protect her from the men who made her scream, and who was only punished for such innocence. As bad as life at home was for Walter, life outside the home wasn't much better, as being the son of a reputed prostitute, along with his appearance, ensured that he was relentlessly bullied by the kids in his neighborhood. However, that bullying would be the key to unlocking something that his mother had caused to fester within him from nearly the moment of his birth: rage. A rage that constantly smoldered within him that was only stoked time and time again by the abuse he was forced to suffer from the people that surrounded him. And when those embers finally became an inferno one sorry day when those 2 boys chose to pick on him, that rage was unleashed in a flurry of violence that saw Walter partially blinding one of these boys with a cigarette and tearing the skin off the other's cheek with his teeth, all when he was just 10 years old. It wouldn't be too long after this that Walter's home life would be investigated, and he'd be taken away from his mother to live at the Lillian Charlton Home for Problem Children in New Jersey, where he remained until 1956. But out of all the events of Walter's childhood, this was perhaps the happiest, as once he left home, Walter became a notedly quiet but amiable enough young man who displayed a great intelligence during his time at school. And sometime later, when Walter learned of his mother's murder at the hands of her pimp, all he could offer in memory of the woman who had treated him so cruelly was a solemn good before that chapter of his life, at least physically, finally came to a close. But he never forgot who he was or where he came from, as both of these aspects of his existence would come to dominate his trajectory in life. Now, what all of this establishes for us is that Walter clearly had a horrible childhood that would have affected anyone in a negative way. And like anyone, the horrible experiences he endured as a youth went on to shape who he was as an adult, especially in regard to his beliefs, worldview, and the development of Rorschach. But there's more that went into Walter's creation of his Rorschach persona than just his childhood. After leaving the group home at the age of 16, Walter became an unskilled laborer working in the garment industry. It's through this profession that he would acquire his signature inkblot mask, as well as the sign that pointed him towards what would become his calling in life. As while working his job one day, a customer named Kitty Genovese refused to claim a dress she ordered because she thought it was ugly, a dress that was seemingly designed to look like one giant Rorschach test. Feeling that it was beautiful rather than ugly, Walter took it home with him and proceeded to play with the fabric, but having no use for it at the time, he stowed it away to be used at a later date. However, 2 years after he acquired this dress, Walter would read a news story about a woman who had been assaulted, tortured, and killed right outside her apartment building. And that woman was Kitty Genovese, a woman who was brutally savaged while almost 40 neighbors ignored her screams or watched as her life was torn from her by an animal wearing human skin. This was one of the most crucial moments in Walter's life, as everything he had experienced as a child as well as his adjacency to this murder lit a spark within him, a realization that the people who ignored or watched as Kitty Genovese was being murdered were just as rotten as the person who murdered this woman, just as those who offered no help to a traumatized young boy as he was abused by all around him were, and those that did the abusing were. And so then and there, Walter decided he was not going to be one of those people. He was not going to stand by as some of the chief problems plaguing humanity, namely the depravity of criminals and the inaction of the bystanders unwilling to do anything about the evil unfolding in front of their eyes, continued to ravage and corrupt the innocent amongst us. No, Walter wasn't going to be a witness to savagery anymore. He was going to do something about it, and he was going to do so wearing a face that he could bear to look at in the mirror, the face of Rorschach. As it was at this moment that Walter Kovacs all but ceased to exist. Walter Kovacs was a man in a costume. Rorschach is not. Rorschach is a hero, a man free from weakness, fear, and lust who does what's right because it must be done. For a time, he operated as any other vigilante of his caliber did, joining up with some of those heroes as a member of the Watchmen to better aid his chances at fighting the good fight. In his early days as a vigilante, for a time, according to Night Owl, Rorschach was rational, or, as he remarked to Dr. Long, soft on scum, still Walter Kovacs, and missing the necessary component to fully become Rorschach. But at that time, he was more or less cut from the same cloth as the other Watchmen, a man who did what he needed to apprehend criminals, but one who turned them over to the authorities whenever he apprehended them. That all changed in 1975 when he decided to pursue the case of a kidnapped little girl named Blair Roche, who was erroneously kidnapped because she was thought to be connected to the Roche chemical fortune. After a few days had passed, Rorschach decided to involve himself, needlessly putting 14 people in the hospital to get information about her whereabouts, and obtaining a tip that led him to where the poor girl was being held. However, by the time he arrived, she had already been murdered, and brutally at that, with her remains being fed to 2 German shepherds outside the property. This sent Rorschach into a frenzy of rage that caused him to pick up a nearby cleaver and kill these 2 dogs, closing his eyes and crying out for his mother as he landed blow after blow on them. And after waiting for their owner to come home, a man named Gerald Grice, he chose to cuff him to a barrel and light his home on fire, but not before giving him a saw he could use to cut off his arm to escape. But he didn't escape. He burned along with his house and the memory of the horror he unleashed there. And Rorschach, well, Rorschach stood outside watching for an hour, and it was here that he came to a dreaded conclusion about this filth-ridden world he lived in, as well as himself. Stood in firelight, sweltering, bloodstain on chest like map of violent new continent. Felt cleansed, felt dark planet turn under my feet, and knew what cats know that makes them scream like babies at night. Looked at sky through smoke heavy with human fat, and God was not there. The cold, suffocating dark goes on forever, and we are alone. Live our lives, lacking anything better to do, devise reason later, born from oblivion, bear children, hellbound as ourselves, go into oblivion. There is nothing else. Existence is random, has no pattern save what we imagine after staring at it for too long, no meaning save what we choose to impose. This rudderless world is not shaped by vague metaphysical forces. It is not God who kills the children, not fate that butchers them, or destiny that feeds them to the dogs. Streets stank of fire, the void breathing hard on my heart, turning its illusions to ice, shattering them. It's us, only us, was reborn then, free to scrawl own design on this morally blank world, was Rorschach. This is how a young boy named Walter evolved into the stalwart, tenacious, and heavy-handed vigilante that is Rorschach. And by cross-referencing this information with the information we receive about Rorschach throughout this story, we find all the pieces we need to understand him. As we watch Rorschach move through this narrative, we quickly learn that he is, despite having a few friends in the former Watchmen, an antisocial loner who cares very little for genuine human interaction, something that came as a result of his constant negative experiences with other people during his youth, where he learned that sexual intercourse and intimacy was akin to a monster to be feared, and that he was an ugly person who was better off left alone. He spends his days with a sign in hand declaring the end of the world, and his nights walking through the sordid streets of New York looking for criminals to take down. At home, He lives a rather disgusting existence, with the smell from his apartment being so bad that his landlady made complaints to him about it on multiple occasions. His person isn't much better, with multiple comments from the people he interacts with about how bad he smells at all times, something that's made all the more worse by the fact that he isn't even a pleasant person to be around, period. When we watch Rorschach in action as an adult, he appears to us as a man hardened by a cruel world that he continues to view as cruel, one who's blunt, stubborn, unforgiving, and uncompromising. Aspects of his character that manifested from a mixture of inherent characteristics and his experiences that have made him an all-around miserable person to be around. But as important of a component as Rorschach's overall personality is to his character, it's really what he says and what he thinks that's more important than how he might say things or how he presents himself. Rorschach is a man who despises criminality in all its forms, and he expresses his distaste for it frequently throughout this story. Women who show any amount of skin are whores, and thieves, murderers, assaulters, and anyone associated with them are considered scum, as are lesser offenders, even people who dare to consume illicit pharmaceuticals in an attempt to potentially alleviate the symptoms of their cancer. And this hatred of all things criminal can be traced directly back to his childhood. Young Walter, as he experienced horror after horror, slowly began to hate the criminal and all things to do with them. The mother who made her living through illicit prostitution, the men who propositioned her, and the boys in his neighborhood, thugs who assaulted another due to his perceived weaknesses and flaws, people who made dishonest livings and took the easy way out, people who took advantage of others to feed their vices, and people who abused others for their own satisfaction. These were the villains of Rorschach's youth, and considering what they did to him and what they exposed him to, he had every right to view them as such. Though that may be true, Rorschach only viewed them in this way, and he never saw the whole picture, just what he perceived. And his perception, as far as he was concerned, was the only thing that mattered and the only thing that was true. He perceived these people as bad, and yes, they were bad in some ways, but to Rorschach, they were all bad. His mother was not a deeply flawed woman who had been put through the ringer herself and come out the other side a miserable person. She was an abusive whore. The men who called on her were not sons, friends, brothers, fathers, or even husbands. They were criminals, men engaged in soliciting a prostitute who were as guilty as the woman they were calling on. The boys who bullied him were not wayward youths who may have been acting out for any number of reasons. They were simply thugs. Now that isn't to say that any of the people who treated Walter poorly when he was a kid deserved to be absolved of any wrongdoing. Far from it. But neither are they cut and dry villains who deserve no leeway whatsoever. But to Walter, they certainly were. And because they were, all people like them were as well. And so everyone like them remained villains as he grew into adulthood. And most importantly, they were only villains and nothing else. In Rorschach's mind, a prostitute could never be a woman doing what she felt she had to feed her children. She would always be a whore and nothing more. A thief stealing a loaf of bread to feed his family could never be anything more than scum, because that's what thieves and all other criminals are. There is no in-between for Rorschach. There are only absolutes, and that's why Rorschach is often inappropriately labeled as a moral absolutist, a man who believes in good and evil and the rigid, unblurred lines that divide them, a mindset derived from the trauma and abuse he suffered that formed a deep-seated hatred for what he believed to be wrong within him. For good and evil, as far as Rorschach was concerned, were as black and white as the mask he came to believe was his true face. In essence, Rorschach had an objective worldview, believing that he and what he believed, total black and white application of the law when evaluating criminals, was right. And what this facet of Rorschach's character embodies alongside moral absolutism, which is something Alan Moore was critiquing with his character, is something else that he was critiquing through Rorschach. Objectivism, the ideology created and espoused by Ayn Rand, who's perhaps most well known for being the author of Atlas Shrugged. As with any philosophy, there's a lot to objectivism. But essentially, Ayn Rand put forth the notion that reality is objective, and that we as human beings only perceive that objective reality and participate in it according to its objective parameters, with reason being our means of understanding that reality, and the highest calling a person can strive towards being the pursuit of their own happiness through self-interest, with laissez-faire capitalism being the only economic system that supports these ideals. My philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose in life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. Now, if that's essentially what objectivism is, how is Rorschach's character a critique of it? Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, Rorschach's entire worldview is black and white, and he believes that objectively, that's the way the world works, without any room for interpretation. And because he holds to this objectivist worldview, and he is who he is, he ends up being a horrifying interpretation of what an objectivist superhero would be like. Rand's assumption was that an objective worldview and a focus on the self and reason would invariably produce men and women who by nature were fulfilled in all ways. People who would be content living in a world that could be understood fully due to its objective nature and the reason one applied when attempting to understand it. And thus they would be as happy as they could be due to their constant pursuit of a self-interest that ensures the prosperity of each and every person as they cater their own lives to their own satisfaction, thus uplifting themselves and those around them. But the problem with an objective worldview is that black and white nature of it, because as nice as it might be for the world to be so simple, so cut and dry, it's decidedly not. And because it isn't, Rorschach is not the shining paragon of unyielding and uncompromising morality and justice that he thinks he is, but a bitter, cynical, and deeply unhappy man whose objective views on the world and life in it are constantly at odds with reality. Ultimately, he lives an unfulfilled existence because his work is never done. The morality that he tries so dearly to uphold is constantly threatened by those who he views as scum. And the reason he so clings to when given more than a passing glance is the reason only of Rorschach, not true reason, and certainly not the truth that he believes it to be. A bleak void, one that needs to be reined in by those willing to rein it in, and those with the will to see reason and do what must be done to protect the world from the follies of man must do so, and that's the objective truth. That's how Rorschach sees the world, but good and evil, nor the crimes that result from evil actions, have never been black and white, no matter how much it might seem that way on the surface. Is murdering your wife's lover after you caught them in the heat of passion the same thing as stalking a woman, kidnapping her, and murdering her via prolonged torture? No, they aren't. They are both murder, but the particulars of said murder are entirely different, and the same can be said for all crimes people commit. That's why all crimes and all acts of evil must be judged for what they are on a case-by-case basis, not for what they are by definition. Because if we did, then stealing a pack of gum would be judged to be just as heinous as robbing a bank is. Yes, there are some things, as far as most human beings are concerned, that are objectively good, and some things that are objectively evil. There are very few people who are going to tell you that eating enough food to stave off your hunger pains isn't a good thing, and there is no place on earth where crimes, at their basest level, are not seen as evil. Murder and thievery are just as wrong in America as they are in Zimbabwe, Korea, Honduras, or anywhere else in the world. What is considered murder and what is considered stealing will vary from place to place, but at their base level, they are wrong everywhere. But that's only at the base level. Beyond that base, each crime, each act of evil, while they could be similar to other acts in the same category, are different and need to be handled accordingly. But that's one of the biggest problems with Rorschach's worldview and actions. There is no variation, no nuance. His objective view of the world is all there is, and that's that. And if you happen to be someone who disagrees, you're either soft or scum, because people are also monoliths as far as he's concerned. And because he feels he knows what right and wrong and good and evil are, he is the most qualified to hand out punishments to the people that he believes need to be punished. And furthermore, because he's such a shining bastion of morality, he's incapable of doing wrong himself. So no amount of violence against criminals, either suspected or confirmed, that he pursues in the line of duty is unwarranted or unjustified. Why does one death matter against so many? Because there is good and there is evil, and evil must be punished. Even in the face of Armageddon, I shall not compromise in this. But there are so many deserving of retribution, and there is so little time. Once a man is seen, he can never turn his back on it, never pretend it doesn't exist, no matter who orders him to look the other way. We do not do this thing because it is permitted. We do it because we have to. We do it because we are compelled. Thoughts like these are what constantly run through Rorschach's mind as he continues to walk along this never-ending road. And while he will hand criminals over to the police, he'll often make sure they're battered and bloodied when they're delivered, even if the crimes they committed weren't deserving of such punishment. And he'll also actively hamper police investigations or harm officers if it means he gets to handle things his way, the only way he believes works. And to make matters worse, on occasion, he'll also serve as judge, jury, and executioner. And even when the killer perhaps deserves that sentence, what Rorschach does, though seeming to be on the surface, is in no way a good thing. And as far as we know, There are 3 specific cases of Rorschach acting as such: the murder of Gerald Grice that I mentioned earlier, the murder of Harvey Charles Furness, a serial assaulter whom Rorschach killed, and then delivered to the police with a note saying never taped to his chest following the passage of the Keene Act, and a supervillain who enjoyed being punished, Captain Carnage, who he dropped down an elevator shaft. But Gerald, Harvey, and Carnage were murderers, assaulters, and supervillains respectively. So why was punishing them so wrong if they deserved it? Well, depending on who you ask, the punishments may not have been wrong, but it's the fact that one man decided that they were appropriate and took matters into his own hands to bring what he believed to be justice to these men. That's what's so wrong about one man taking matters into his own hands like this, because although he believes that he's acting in the best interest of humanity and society as a whole, he never stops to ask whether or not that whole he claims to uphold and protect feel the same way. There is no agreed upon consensus as far as Rorschach's activities are concerned. He is not a man who has been handed a mandate by the people he protects and serves. He's a man who's decided he's going to protect and serve people in the way he believes is best, without compromise. He takes matters into his own hands, and in the hands of Rorschach, brutality and cruelty are doled out to those that may deserve it, and to those that may not, because in his mind, they all deserve it, no matter what they may have done, and to what degree they may have done it. That's why, by and large, innocent until proven guilty by a jury of your peers has become the gold standard, with a representative afforded to you to properly explain the details of your case and defend you, and an officer of the court who oversees these proceedings to ensure those proceedings go as fairly as possible. Now, the justice system is by no means totally fair and perfect, as every single day, no, every single second of every single day, somewhere across the world, there is a miscarriage of justice occurring. But if there was no framework in place for justice to be carried out, then the miscarriage of justice would be magnified tenfold as vigilantes, both trained and untrained alike, take up that calling and cause further harm to people in ways they may not deserve, or by harming people collaterally as they take their fights to the streets to hand out punishments in any way they wished, whether appropriate or not. And the fact of the matter is, if you're a person who actively seeks out the harm of others in order to satisfy your need for justice, whether that be by murdering people in the line of duty, or putting 14 people in the hospital in order to gather information, you're not much better than the criminals you're trying to punish. You're a killer and a brute who's just as violent and arguably unhinged as they are. But as much as all we've discussed so far about Rorschach's character is integral to understanding him, there's one more very important thing I've yet to mention that factors heavily into who he is and what he does, what was, and what could have been. Women's breasts draped across every billboard, every display littering the sidewalk, was offered Swedish and French love while walking, but not American love, like Coke in green glass bottles. They don't make it anymore. This is something Rorschach writes in his journal after he visits Moloch for the first time, and this statement, as well as some other observations we received before and after this point, highlights something very important about Rorschach, that he is a man who believes that his country is in decline, that it was once great and prosperous, but has begun to unravel at the seams due to the existence and efforts of scum, who erode this once great nation with every breath that they take. Those scum are anyone who don't believe in America as it was classically portrayed in propaganda and media, an America of decency, family values, hard work, and God-fearing morals, and the enemy of that America is the left and all associated with them. Liberals, communists, homosexuals, government programs, hippies, these are the people who Rorschach openly vilifies as this story unfolds. And, like everything about Rorschach, this attitude of his can be tied back to his childhood and his experiences, or lack thereof. My Parents, by Walter Kovacs. I have 2 parents, although actually, I don't have any. I never see my mom, but that's okay, although I would like to see my dad sometimes. I have never met my dad, and I would sure like to. He had to leave our house when I wasn't even born, I guess because he couldn't get along with my mother. I would have done the same if I was him. I used to ask my mom about my dad, but she doesn't talk much about him. His name was Charlie, which is short for Charles, although it has the same number of letters. She says she doesn't know his second name, although how can you live with somebody if you don't know who they are? It is just stupid. My mom told me she threw my dad out because he was always getting into political arguments with her because he liked President Truman and she didn't. I think perhaps my dad was some sort of aide to President Truman because he liked him so much. Most probably he was out of the country during the war when I was growing up on some sort of mission. I think he was the kind of guy who would fight for his country and what was right. Maybe he got killed fighting the Nazis and he's with God now, and that's how come he never managed to find me. I like President Truman, the way Dad would have wanted me to. He dropped the atom bomb on Japan and saved millions of lives, because if he hadn't have, then there would have been a lot more war than there was, and more people would have been killed. I think it was a good thing to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. That is all I have to say about my parents. As we've covered, Rorschach despised his mother, but through hatred of her, he came to idolize a fantasy version of the father he never knew. The father who could be anything he wished him to be, that surely escaped from his mother because of how terrible of a person she was. A man of morals, of courage, of decency, a patriotic man who was the personification of the quintessential American man. A man who would have served his country, worked hard, and played catch with his son on the weekend, whilst they drank ice-cold Cokes straight from green glass bottles. But that's all this vision of Walter's father was, a fantasy much like the America he believed was being destroyed was. As we know all too well, Rorschach's childhood was as miserable as they come, and because we know that whatever supposed golden age of American culture he pines for was something that he likely never experienced, or experienced minimally. It was the America he saw on TV, the one on billboards, brochures, and songs that sang of a gay old time for all nestled in the safety and security of a dignified nation. But that's not reality. It was for some, but not for most. It's the world he wanted to live in, a world that he felt he'd been promised that was empty as the hole his experiences had left in his heart. But in reality, even his high school sweethearts went to catch a movie at the drive-in and drank Coke from green glass bottles. A little boy was being traumatized and abused by his mother in a seedy apartment in the heart of New York, ever wishing to catch some of that happiness in one of those bottles. The world is a different place for each and every one of us, and the glamorous images we receive of how the world is for the most privileged among us have never been the way things truly are for anyone, no matter which era of human history or place that you're talking about. It's only that way for the people fortunate enough to be a part of those privileged few, and these things are shown to us as what we could have, to keep those few enjoying those privileges, unbothered by the unwashed masses that they so desperately try to suppress in order to make these things possible. And for Rorschach, Walter Kovacs, the world was not what he wanted it to be, but he never stopped wishing that it could be, and working towards reviving it once he believed it had been destroyed. Every day the future looks a little bit darker, but the past, even the grimy parts of it, keep on getting brighter. This is a quote from Sally Jupiter that sums up quite well why Rorschach views the world in this way, and also why such views resonate with so many people, and why others so easily take advantage of people who view the world in this way. People who cling to another ideology that Alan Moore was attempting to criticize in this narrative: fascism. The entirety of Watchmen is built upon the notion that at its core, the superhero genre is fascistic in nature, but there are two characters in particular in the story who embody this idea in spades: Rorschach and the man he admired, the comedian. If Rorschach is the proverbial basement-dwelling new frontiersman reading right-wing conspiracy theorist and cynic, then the comedian is the kick-ass and take-names American super soldier fighting to preserve his country that said basement dweller idolizes and wishes they could be. More than that though, both Rorschach and the comedian are men who believe in the country they were told was the greatest in the world, the aspects that made it great, and the need for men like them to stand up and protect it, no matter the cost to themselves and others. Blake understood, treated it like a joke, saw the cracks in society, saw the little men in mass trying to hold it together. He saw the true face of the 20th century and chose to become a reflection, a parody of it. That's how Rorschach saw the comedian and the world they both tried to preserve. But why does that make them fascists, or at least an echo of fascism? Well, fascism, while made up of many components, relies on four key things in particular: ultranationalism, a strongman leader, a perceived golden age that has since been lost, and the enemy that needs to be destroyed in order to revive it. And Rorschach is all of these things. He's a patriot who believes in a golden vision for America, a vision that has since been blurred by the various enemies seeking to blind it. And so he's made himself into a force of a man who strives to defend that vision and eliminate its enemies whenever he can. And because these are the most crucial aspects of any fascist existence, they are ever the hypocrites. Men and women who decry the supposed evils of the world with every breath they take, who are more than willing to allow those aligned with them to commit those very same evils so long as they serve their country. Like a comedian who once attempted to assault a woman and who shot and killed a pregnant woman, whose moral lapses shouldn't be judged in the face of his service and patriotism. "Look what they've taken from you" is the most powerful statement in the fascist lexicon. and it's led many a person astray who believes they've been lied to by their so-called betters, or had their worlds taken from them by people who seek to destroy them and everyone they love. Make no mistake, Rorschach truly loves his country, and while he may be a fascist, he at the very least, though he was rather close to being one and couldn't really see that, wasn't a Nazi, as he balked when Adrian labels the comedian one, and decried Hitler when Night Owl defends Ozymandias by stating he's a vegetarian, to which Rorschach responds that Hitler was a vegetarian. But regardless, his love for his country is fueled by hate for everything that he believes is destroying it, which only makes sense, as hate is only a corruption of love. For to hate something, you must love something just as much, if not more. But what we want and what we feel was taken from us, and what reality is, are altogether different. The world is always changing, always moving forward, and while it's not a bad thing to preserve the good things about the current day that we'd like to see our children and their children enjoy in the future, lamenting the aspects of times long past that are never going to come back, or be the same as they were if they do come back, does nothing to help anybody. And by focusing on these things, it only fuels the anger and resentment you might feel in the face of the unsatisfactory aspects of the world you live in, without giving you any clear way to make them satisfactory, outside of placing the blame onto others, and ruminating on what could be, if only this or that were different. This is what Rorschach is, a walking black hole filled with anger and resentment for a world that has treated him and others so poorly, and that is being actively stripped of its golden veneer. And though Rorschach comments whilst investigating Ozymandias' home that he always mistrusted fascination with relics and dead kings, he is ultimately consumed by the worship of a relic, his idolized version of America that never was for him, never was for many, and never will be again, if it ever was. And when you look at his worldview, it's really that of a child who looks at the world in terms of bad guys and good guys, a world where the lost kingdom of a golden age was taken from him and so many others that needs to be fought for in order to preserve what's left of it and to resurrect it. A child who never learned how to care for himself or others due to the abuses thrown at him by all those around him, who wallows in petulant misery over the things he cannot change and the things he has deluded himself to be true. And when you really peel back the layers of Rorschach's character, you find a man who despises himself almost as much, or perhaps even more, than everyone around him did. He despised Walter Kovacs, so he made himself into something he could be proud of, a hero who fought to keep darkness at bay, who was so wholly consumed with his mission that all the pain he felt was masked by the ever-present misery he willingly plunged himself into day after day. And in the end, he died exactly how he lived, stalwart, stubborn, and uncompromising when it came to his views and what he believed was right. A man who was willing to doom a world already damaged by an equally, yet differently unhinged man, for the sake of the truth, and each and every one of the innocent lives he believed deserved to be saved, even in the face of Armageddon. And at this end, what is there to say about Rorschach? He was a boy who was heavily abused and denied a world of wonder that was only a fantasy. A boy who grew into a man who was rigid, uncompromising, and filled with cynicism, rage, and a quiet hatred for everything that had made him into who he was, and that he believed had taken everything from him. But at the end of the day, after reviewing all we know about Rorschach, was he an evil person, a villain as villainous as the many pursued? No, Rorschach was not an evil person. He was not a person who ever endeavored to hurt people for the sake of it, to harm others financially or physically for his own financial gain or pleasure, or one who entertained acts of evil in the pursuit of power. No, not an evil person, nor a villain, but an anti-hero, a deeply flawed, misguided anti-hero who served justice, yes, but also pain and misery, one whose dedication to doing what was right is admirable, but a man who committed acts of evil in the pursuit of upholding the greater good and protecting the innocent from a world he saw as a black abyss filled with horror. An evildoer, if there ever was one, who was only trying to do good, sometimes doing so, but also failing in the process. A man who in many ways always remained the broken little boy he was, and who serves as a cautionary tale of what terror can come from a person steeped in trauma, moral absolutism, objectivism, and fascism. A man who was not wholly good and not wholly evil. A man who deserves to be pitied, if not excused. A man who was forged by evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Rorschach? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially our Dark Lord patrons. Elijah Kai VA, Mr. Awesome, Louis Dockstader, Just Keeping It Real, Lachlan, Atris Rain, Seltsopa, Him Downstairs, Off Mega, Beep Boop, Lorenzo Antonino, and Eli Livingston. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.